All right, so we're off and running. So tonight, the calendar actually works out. I'm able to be topical. So because Hanukkah starts next week, I thought it might be nice to let people know why we're doing Hanukkah and how we do Hanukkah. It's not the most complicated Jewish holiday. It's not the most important Jewish holiday in the giant calendar of events, but it is a very significant holiday, and it symbolizes so much, and it has so much meaning built into it. So we definitely don't want to miss it, since I have the window of talking about it before the holiday actually happens. All right, so the first thing to talk about is why we celebrate Hanukkah. And this is the story that is given in the Talmud, in Masechet Shabbat, for you to see, but I will read anyway. As the Talmud puts it, for when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they made all of the oil that was in the sanctuary unclean. That is to say, they rendered it ritually impure. Doesn't mean that they deliberately contaminated it, but because they were involved in idolatry, the oil that was there automatically is assumed to have been dedicated for idolatrous practices. So therefore, it's not available for any use. But when the rule of the Hashmonean house took hold, they conquered them. They searched but found only a single jar of oil, lying with the seal of the high priest. So this one they found sort of secreted away. They could tell that it hadn't been touched, it hadn't been opened, it was still intact. But that jar had enough oil only for a single day. But there was a miracle done with it. They lit the lamp with it for 8 days. The next year, they assigned these days and made them festival days for the recitation of Hallel, for Psalms, and for Thanksgiving. We're going to come back into what Hallel and Thanksgiving, or Modim as it's called, means for our liturgy later on. Okay, does this story sound familiar?
Yes.
Okay. Remember why I call it Story A? Because the story of Hanukkah is not found as a full narrative text anywhere within classic Jewish literature. That is to say, anywhere within canonized texts. It is not within Tanakh, obviously, because it happened long after the Tanakh was closed. The Bible was already finished, and therefore we were not adding new chunks to it. But in the Mishnah, in the Midrash, and in the Talmud, we also don't find much more information than what I just read, which leaves us looking for additional support. Now, much of it was passed on really orally. That is to say, people did talk about the Hashmoneans, they talked about the Maccabees, they talked about the fight, but they didn't go into a whole lot of detail. The place you can find more detail is in the Book of the Maccabees. There are books that were written around the time of the Maccabees that describe the story of the Maccabees. They're not considered to be divine. They were not considered to be inspired, so they don't make their way into the Bible. Rabbinic literature, so they're not in the Mishnah, the Midrash, or the Talmud, but they do exist. And when we read them, a very different emphasis. So this is just a tiny selection about the specifics of the holiday of Hanukkah itself, not about the entire story of the Maccabees, although I'll give you the thumbnail of that in a second. So, regarding the holiday itself, the holiday that we are about to celebrate, then Judah and his brothers said, "Behold, our enemies are routed. Let us go up now to cleanse the holy places and repair them." Then Judah appointed men to fight against those that were in the castle till they had cleansed the holy places. So if you've ever seen maps or diagrams of what ancient Jerusalem looked like, the temple precinct, but there was also a citadel, a castle that was connected. And so what's happening here is they're dividing their forces, and they have driven out the enemies from the area around the temple, but there are still people locked up in the castle. So some are going to attack / contain the castle people, and the others are working on restoring, rededicating the temple area. Got the image? Got it. Then they took whole stones according to the law and built a new altar. The old altar had to be torn down because the old altar had been used for idol worship. And they built up the holy places and the things that were within the temple, and they sanctified the temple and the courts. And they made new holy vessels, new items and things that were used for the sacrifices, and brought in the menorah, the candelabra, of incense, and the table into the temple. So they are getting everything back into place where it was supposed to be after it had all been thrown out and put away when they had when our enemies had taken the temple over. And they put incense upon the altar, lighted the lamps that were upon the candlestick, the menorah, and they gave light in the temple. So all things are being relit. They arose before the morning of the 25th day of the 9th month. That's called Kislev, the month in the 148th year, which by our calendar is the year 165 BCE. And they offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar. So the sacrificial system is going back into business on the altar that they've made. And on the same day when the heathens had defiled it, and they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days. So that happened that they rededicated it on the same day that it had been desecrated by the attackers. Make sense? All right. So any difference between these two accounts?
Well, this
apart from one's longer.
Right. Well, this one doesn't say that they found the oil.
Yeah, no mention of oil. No mention of oil. And as we're going to see in our other excerpt, this one taken from the second book of Maccabees, which isn't actually the sequel, like Maccabees, the Revenge, right? The second book of Maccabees is another account of the story of the Maccabees, which provides additional detail and reinforcing detail. It doesn't mention the oil either. What they all agree upon is that it was for 8 days. Now, the Talmud describes the 8 days being because of the oil. The text we just read describes the 8 days because that was how long you dedicated the altar. And that should be ringing connection bells back to the story in Leviticus and Vayikra. 8 days to dedicate the Mishkan, the tabernacle, with the tent that had been built in the wilderness. And so rededicating the temple is echoing back to the 8 days of that dedication. So it's trying to bring it full circle to that first moment of having a Mishkan. It's a different or complementary view. That's why this is story be continued. So now upon the same day that the temple had been polluted by the strangers, on the very same day it was cleansed again. To wit, on the 5 and 20th day of the month of Kislev. So we all agree on that, the 25th day of Kislev. And they kept 8 days with joy after the manner of the feast of Sukkot, remembering that not long before they had kept the feast of Sukkot when they were in the mountains and in dens like wild beasts. So when it was the regular time for the holiday of Sukkot, they couldn't come to the temple, they couldn't offer the sacrifices, they couldn't worship as was our custom. Instead, they were living in the hills and they were fighting for their lives. Now, just a couple months later, here they are back in the temple and able to rededicate it. Therefore, they now carried boughs and green branches and palms for him. Sounds like Sukkot, sounds like the lulav that we do on Sukkot, and that they had given them good success in cleansing this place. And they ordained by a common statute, they all agreed and decreed that all the nations of the whole nation of Jews should keep those days every year. So the first Hanukkah, according to this account, was basically a make-up Sukkot. Because how long is Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret? 8 days, yeah. Right? So we now have 3 competing versions of why we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days, or indeed why it's this time of the year that we celebrate the victory of the Maccabees. One is the idea that they found the oil. One is that it was a rededication, that it was a parallel to the original dedication of the tabernacle. And one is that it was a make-up holiday for Sukkot that turned into a repeat every year as a celebration of that victory.
Where's the restroom?
The restroom? If you go down the long hallway by the drinking fountain. No problem. So a lot of people will argue, well, that means this story's real, or that story's real, or this story's made up, or that story's a fairy tale. And they're missing the point. Because these 3 stories are not necessarily fighting with each other. To see that all 3 of them could happen simultaneously, or to see that they may even be describing the same thing from 3 points of view, is one of the miracles of Hanukkah. So let's take the more historical view, right? The book of Maccabees, which doesn't deal with the oil and such. So rededicating the temple for 8 days and rededicating the temple by also celebrating Sukkot makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense because we need to rededicate the temple. We should do what was done before. And we missed Sukkot, which is considered to be the most important festival in the ancient world because it was the one that was really seen as triggering the agricultural blessings that God would bring. And they knew that if they didn't have a chance to have that celebration of Sukkot, that perhaps the winter would go badly and there would be nothing growing by next year. So they really felt they needed to do Sukkot if they could. So doing those together, they're both 8 days, it makes perfect sense. Now, with regards to the oil, there are many that argue that the story of the oil was not intended to be a literal story, but was instead considered to be a code story. That this was a parable that was very important for two reasons. One reason was when you're living among the Romans, talking about a small group of people who defeated a large army, it makes the Romans nervous. Not only does it make the Romans nervous, but it makes many of the Jews very aggressive. We may not always think about it, or at least until very recently, many people didn't think about it, but we were known as troublemakers in the Roman Empire. Right? We were the guys who were constantly staging revolts. Even though we were this tiny little nation, we kept giving Rome trouble and trying to break free of its empire. And the rabbis were, after the worst of those revolutions, very eager to tell people, stop, right? Stop trying to make a revolution. Now is not the moment. And so by telling the story through the lens of the oil, it would help calm that down. It would also keep the Romans from getting too worried that we were starting another revolt. The additional parable of this has to do with the fact that the Hashmoneans, who are the kings that come from the Maccabees, turn out pretty bad. That is to say, they're not very good kings. They were great soldiers. They were wonderful leaders during the time of the revolt. But when the fighting was done, their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren turn out to really be rotten kings. They are corrupt. They are no longer really keeping the Jewish way. And they are the direct reason why Rome comes into Israel. Because two brothers are fighting to see who's going to be king next, and they each ask Rome to settle the argument. Rome picks the winner and then moves the army in. So they weren't popular. So if you were to go around talking about, oh, the Hashmoneans, they were the great fighters, they freed us from the empire, blah, 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 it's like saying, you know, the guys who used to be so bad, they did some things good. Usually when people are so bad, you just don't want to talk about their good stuff at all. But how does the oil story work? Well, the oil story fits perfectly with the message of Hanukkah, right? The oil story is that there was only a small amount that was still pure, that wasn't contaminated, that hadn't become blended with the idolatry of our enemies. And that small group was able to last longer than anyone would expect. That small group was able to do a miracle. That small jug was able to keep going long enough until more would join, and then we were able to get things back into normal. So the miracle of the victory of the Maccabees is perfectly paralleled by the metaphor of the oil, of the little that was able to fight against the great, of the pure that was able to defeat the impure. It is a very beautiful way of expressing it. Now, did it really happen or not? I wasn't there. All right, so it's not essential to believe it literally, but it is essential to believe the truth of what the rabbis are saying in the Talmud, which is that the small can defeat the mighty, and that the pure can defeat the impure. That is the message. All right, so just one little, because we're we got a lot to do. I do want to give you a little bit about the story of Hanukkah, because there's just a few things that always keep coming up that people get wrong about how the battle began, how the war began. So the battle of the Maccabees, who were the fighters that eventually had the victory that led to the holiday of Hanukkah, they were living in a time when our country had been taken over a group called the Seleucid Empire. And I say over, because we had first been taken over by the Babylonians back in 586 when they destroyed the first temple. And the Babylonians were taken over by the Persians. And the Persians were taken over by Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, when he died, his empire was taken over by his generals. Now, the people who took over in Egypt were called the Ptolemies, and in the middle of Asia were called the Seleucids. They were not from Greece. They didn't have Greek DNA. They didn't have Greek passports, but they believed in Greek culture. They believed in what we call Hellenism, the idea that Greek culture was the best way to live. So much like you might find people around the world who like American culture and who like American movies and want to speak English and want to do things the American way, movement in that part of the world of trying to make things more Greek. Now, up to this point, most of the time, these empires were okay with us just going on and doing our Jewish life. But one of the Seleucid emperors who took over, called Antiochus, or Antiochus Epiphanes IV, I think is his official title, he decided that he wanted to make everything the same, what we call homogenized, so that people would have the same language, they would have the same culture, the same religion. And that's when we said, no, we'll pay you taxes, we'll let you be in charge, but we have to still be allowed to be Jewish. The Persians let us be Jewish, Alexander let us be Jewish, the Ptolemies let us be Jewish, the early Seleucids let us be Jewish. Just let us be Jewish and don't cause any trouble. Well, he didn't want that to happen. He wanted everyone to be following this Greek culture. But remember, they weren't actually from Greece. So a lot of people think that they were like Spartans or Athenians and other people from Greece. They weren't from Greece, they were just using Greek culture. And that was what sparked the fight when the Maccabees were the first group to say, we're not going to just give up our culture. We're not trying to rescue our land. We're just trying to rescue our religion, our faith, our people, our culture. And that's how they began. And they started off with a small group, as they said, fighting from the hills, attacking. Eventually, they pulled together a big army, and they were able to defeat the Seleucids, even though the Seleucids were much bigger and stronger as a nation. And the war went on a lot longer, the story. So we finish here with the rededication of the temple, but the battles and the treaties and the broken treaty, that went on for another 20 years of fighting before we were able to stabilize our position in the region. So it wasn't like, boom, we won. It was, okay, we won this. And then the war keeps going. But tonight we're just focused on the Hanukkah part. Good? All right. Go read more. There's a lot more information out there, but that's enough to at least get onto how we do this. So because of the story, one of the things that is critical to the celebration of Hanukkah is understanding that when we light the menorah, it is for publicizing the miracle, publicizing our success, our survival, our victory. So as Rambam points out, it is a mitzvah to place the Hanukkah lamp at the outside of the entrance to one's home, within the handbreadth that is closest to the doorway on the left side as one enters the home, so that the mezuzah will be on the right and the Hanukkah lamp will be on the left. Okay, so there's a bit of a problem here, which is how many people here live in a house? There's like a gate at the front, and then you have a big open courtyard, and then you have your house in the back. Yeah, no one. Right. In the old days, that's what you did. You had a wall in the front of your house, and where they're sitting, there was a gate, and then there was a big open courtyard, and you did your work and other things there, and then the house you lived in was back here. Well, in those houses, the Hanukkah lamp was out there. And if you go to Jerusalem today, in the old city, some houses that are like this, you can see right outside the door, there's a little box in the wall or attached to the wall that is for Hanukkah, where they will light the Hanukkah menorah during the 8 days. But for most of us who don't live in that kind of courtyard house, we use our windows, which means that we light the Hanukkah lamp at the window so that it can be seen from outside the house. Now, as it points on, when a person lives in an apartment, and there used to be apartments even back then, you still have to light it on the window that faces out to the public area so that it can be seen by other people. Now think for a second, why is that so important to the story of Hanukkah? Well, I mean, who cares about publicity? Anyone?
Oh, because the small was trying to overtake that mighty, so it's like showing that the small is still like moving forward.
Exactly. The small is still there. We haven't given up, right? The whole point of Hanukkah was that the small group was willing to stand up and say, no, right? We are going to continue to be Jewish. And so when we light the Hanukkah lamp, it is still a statement of, no, we are not giving up. We are still here, and we're not afraid of you, right? We're not afraid of you. We are willing to be noticed, people that are around us. However, in a time of danger, a person can place the Hanukkah lamp inside his house, even if he lit it on his table, right? So there is a little bit of a blend here, which is, don't be stupid about this. So if you were living in Germany during World War II, you would not light the Hanukkah lamp at your front window. You would still try to light the Hanukkah lamp. And indeed, there are many stories from World War II of people lighting the Hanukkah lamps in the ghettos and lighting them when they were hiding, but in their basement or in the attic, or of lighting them even in the concentration camps. People would get enough oil together and would try to light a Hanukkah lamp in secret. So they would still try to light, and it was still a way of showing defiance, of showing strength, of showing that we are still here. But it wasn't being stupid. So there is a limit. Yes.
I am very defiant. Is that bad?
To be defiant?
Yes, I'm very proud of my heritage.
And that's good.
For example, today I posted the flag of Israel, and I'm proud of my ancestral home on Instagram, and I got blasted by a lot of anti-Semitic, and I blasted back in their own word. And whenever I wear my kippah and stuff like that, I've been confronted, and I said, if you want to step outside, I will teach you. I'll give you a free Krav Maga lesson. Right. Is that bad of being that defined, or God commands us to be a little bit more?
So being proud of being Jewish, and especially in a country like the United States, where our rights to be Jewish are protected not only by us, but by the law. So we don't have to worry about the king, betraying us. It is absolutely fine to be proud. Now, to be deliberately confrontational, to go around looking for people to fight, that we don't do. Right?
No,
and
when people attack you and they try to mock you and stuff like that, I don't quiet down. I go forward. Yeah,
you can just say, whatever. That's your foolishness.
Okay,
right.
So it's not, I'm in my right.
Again, don't go picking fights.
No, of course.
Don't be the first one to throw a fist. Don't let them make you behave like them. Okay. But you don't have to back down. You don't have to run away. You don't have to go, oh, I'm sorry. Correct. You don't have to apologize. You don't have to apologize for being Jewish.
Correct.
Right. Many of our ancestors at other times in history, they did. And that is something that we should be very grateful that we don't have to live like they did, that we are able to be proud and be strong and not live in that kind of fear. All right, one other thing about the lighting, and this is going to come up even more when we get to the details, and that's when we light, there has to be another light in the room, right? Another lamp must be burning in the house to provide one's light for regular activities, for just your boring stuff. If a fire is burning in the house, meaning like a fireplace, not like your house is on fire. If there's a fireplace going, then an additional candle or light is not necessary. But for a prestigious person, for an honorable person who doesn't normally use the light of the fireplace, then an additional candle is required, meaning they still need regular light. Now, why is this? Because unlike the candles for Shabbat, which we talked about last week, the candles for Hanukkah can't be used for anything. What they have is to shine for the miracle. And that means you don't read your book by it, you don't do your sewing by it, you don't use the light. It only has one job, and that is publicity. And that means in the room, you need to have another light, or else you're using its light for the wrong reason. Does that make sense? Right now, lights like this are perfectly fine. But as we're going to see, for most of you, when you go to light your Hanukkah menorah, or Hanukkah as it is often called, there is already a built-in solution to this problem. Okay, and that's called the helper candle or the shamash. If you look at most of the Hanukkahs, the menorahs, the lamps that are already built, they usually come with 9 places for candles. Well, we're going to talk about how many candles we need, but we usually only light at maximum 8 candles for Hanukkah. What's number 9? Number 9 is that extra light. That way I'm guaranteed that if I'm getting light that's letting me do something that's regular, it's coming from that candle, not from the other 8. Right? And when I go to light, I am using it to light the other candles. That way I'm not making them do work. I'm not using the other candles to light each other. I'm using just the one helper candle to light all the other ones. Okay, so that servant candle serves that purpose. Okay, so how many candles do you need to light? Oh, I'll back up here. Everybody already read it already. I should have asked that question. How many candles do you need to light each night?
1.
Candles need to light on day number 2.
2,
2,
3.
No,
3.
Oh, yes.
1, 2.
1.
1.
So technically,
I understand.
what? Right? Technically, the first night of Hanukkah, you could light 1 candle. Not the helper and 1, just light 1 candle. And the second night of Hanukkah, you could light just 1 candle. And the third night, you could light 1 candle. That is what we call the minimum for the mitzvah. The minimum for the mitzvah. Now, most people nowadays don't do that. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, when oil and candles were expensive, if somebody was poor, you think they could afford 44 candles? That's how many candles you need for the entire 8 days, right? That's a lot, right? And a lot of oil. Rambam explains, based on the Talmud, based on the Mishnah, that light on Hanukkah, the mitzvah is a single candle that should be lit in every house, regardless if there are many people or not. A person who performs the mitzvah in a more beautiful way, a conscientious way, if they're trying to be extra, they're trying to really make the mitzvah better, they should light a candle for each person in the house, for each member of the house. So like in my house, I've got 4 people, me, my wife, my 2 kids. So according to the middle level, I would light 4 candles. Just 4 candles. However, a person who is even more conscientious, really, really excited for Hanukkah and wants to do this really beautifully, then they would observe it in the most desirable manner. They should light candles for every member of the household, a candle for each individual, whether male or female, on the first night. And on the subsequent night, they should light a candle for, they should add a candle. So what does this mean? This is what you're more familiar with. On the first night, you light 1, 2. On the next night, you light 3, and so on and so forth. But he's saying the best way to do this is to have a whole Hanukkah, a whole menorah for each member of the family. So if you come over to my house, or if you hang out outside my window, you'll see a little creepy. Yeah, little creepy. My wife, myself, and my 2 kids, we are all lighting our own Hanukkahot. So there are 4 Hanukkahot that are shining out into our window, because that is the best way. But if you could only light 1 candle, that's still enough. Right? Remember, it's back to that little bit of oil. Even a little is enough. If you can do more, do more. And the light only gets better and brighter. But just a little is the first thing. Okay, so how do we light? Confused on this. So I'm going to try and make it very, very clear. We add candles from right to left, and we light them from left to right. What that means is pictures. Okay, on day 1, I have my helper candle here, and I have the first candle over here. So I light my helper candle, and then I light that candle after the blessings, but we'll get to the blessings in a minute. Day 2, I have the helper candle here, and a candle here, and a candle here, but I light this one first, because that's the new candle, right? Because I went from that to that. That's the new candle. that's the one I light first. Everyone following? Day 3, day 4, day 5. And remember, I'm still lighting this one first, and then lighting all the others. Lighting this one, then lighting the others. Lighting this one, then lighting the others. Right? So they come up right to left, and then with my helper, I light them left to right. Make sense? Another way to think of it is reading Hebrew, reading English. So you do the Hebrew first, then you do the English. Make sense? Yeah. Once you've done it a few times, it's really, really easy. But a lot of people, for some reason, seem to get confused on that. Okay. When do we light? I mean, not just on Hanukkah, but what time of Hanukkah do we light? Again, going back to Rambam, because he's just a really good summarizer. The Hanukkah candles should not be kindled, should not be lit before sunset, except on Shabbat. Right? For Shabbat, Friday night, you have to light them before you light your Shabbat candles. Instead, they should be lit at sunset. So when the sun goes down, that's the best time to light the Hanukkah candles. As we're going to see, that's the best time. Because one shouldn't light later or earlier. One forget, or even if one did it on purpose and didn't light at sunset, one can light after, as long as there are, until there are no longer any passerbyers in the marketplace. Now, in the ancient world, after sunset, everything's shut down, right? What are you going to do? There are no street lights, no headlights, no shop lights. No one's going to light a whole bunch of lamps in their shop in order to keep selling 24 hours a day, like a supermarket now. So once the sun went down, everyone packed up and locked the doors and went home. If you're trying to publicize the miracle, right? If you're trying to show people the wonder of Hanukkah, you need people to see. Because what's the point of putting it at my window at 2 o'clock in the morning? Who's going to see that? So at sunset was the best time in the ancient world, because that was precisely the time that most people were heading back to their homes, either coming in from the field or coming back from their shops or finishing up their work in the marketplace and then heading home. And so right at sunset was the perfect time to show everybody the miracle of Hanukkah. But if you missed that moment, for whatever reason, you could still light as long as there were still some people out there. Now, some people argue in the modern world that depending upon where you live, that could be all night. Right? When I lived in Los Angeles, there were people on the road all the time. But it is still best to light at the time when most people are still out there. So the usual guidelines in the modern world, depending upon where you live, is by the time rush hour is over, you should probably have lit by then, right? So here in North America, that's usually around 6:30, 7 o'clock. You should be done by then. Now, if you have to light a little bit later, as long as there are still cars on the road, people walking their dogs or doing whatever, then you're still doing it fine. Make sense? Okay. And like I said, for Shabbat, we do have to light a little bit earlier. But nowadays, the candles on the Hanukkah burn long enough that they will be burning into this time period, so it's not a problem. And for Havdalah, at the end of Shabbat, we do Havdalah first, and then we light the Hanukkah. Right? So Hanukkah is like a bookend. It comes before Shabbat and after Shabbat, and Shabbat's in the middle, a Shabbat sandwich. Hanukkah is special, but Shabbat is still more important than Hanukkah. So we're not lighting candles on Shabbat. Question? Yeah.
But how long we have to the Hanukkah before we do the
Shabbat candles?
Shabbat candle.
It doesn't need to be any time at all. You can light the Hanukkah and then you can walk over, and because if that's at the window, and then you walk over to the room that you're in, and you can light your Shabbat candles.
Okay.
You don't need to put a break.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? And as the Talmud also points out, the lighting of the Hanukkah, this mitzvah, is for women as well, because they were also involved in the miracle, right? It wasn't only the men who were freed and saved, it was the whole nation. If you are a woman and you live alone, you still light your Hanukkah menorah. You don't say, oh, it's a time-bound positive commandment, therefore only men do it. No, women do it as well. How we doing? Okay. Moving along. blessings. So you'll be able to find in any good Siddur the Hebrew blessings, but I want to talk about what they mean and what we think about as we like them. On the first night of Hanukkah, we say 3 blessings. Through 8th night of Hanukkah, we only say the first 2. And I'll explain as we look at the content. So the first blessing is going to sound really familiar because it is almost exactly the same as the blessing we do for Shabbat, which is, blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to light the Hanukkah lamp, right? Lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah, rather than lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. So we make it fit for Hanukkah, but otherwise it is the same as Shabbat, because this is the standard blessing for when we are about to light something for a commandment. Good so far? Okay. The second one is the Hanukkah-specific blessing, not just the lighting, but only for Hanukkah. We say this type of blessing, which is, again, blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who made miracles for our ancestors. And this is the quote from Rambam, but it goes off to finish by saying, at this time, meaning this time of year. So, Bazman Hazeh is the conclusion. Should have caught that he had abbreviated when I was cutting the quote out, I should have realized that he had abbreviated that. But he assumed that everyone already knew this. One is what we call the Shehechianu. And the Shehechianu is a blessing we say for mitzvahs that are new to us that year, new to us at that time. So when we have Passover, when we have Passover is a Sukkot is an example, shaking the lulav is an example. Anytime we're doing a mitzvah for the first time in that calendar cycle, we say the Shehechianu, but only when it's new. Because once we've done it, then it's not new anymore. And so we say this on the first night only. And the full text is, blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, life, and who has sustained us, who has kept us alive, and who has allowed us to reach this moment. So that's the third blessing that we do on Hanukkah first night. Pretty clear?
This isn't related to this, but blessing on the first Shabbat of the New Year as well?
No, because it isn't associated with Shabbat, but there are some other non-holiday times that we say it. So, for example, if you are wearing new clothes, we say the Shehechianu. If you see a friend that you haven't seen for more than a month, you say the Shehechianu. And for things like that, new fruit that's new to the season, the first summer's watermelon or something like that. I mean, nowadays it's hard because we eat fruit all year round out of season, but our ancestors were more aware that watermelon in summer was much better than watermelon in winter. It's just, it didn't have to come across the world. Okay. Yeah, I mentioned at the very beginning where the rabbis were in the Talmud were saying that in honor of Hanukkah, we do Hallel, and we also do a Thanksgiving prayer. So let's talk about Hallel first. Hallel is Psalms 113 through 118 on our major holidays. And as Rambam points out, on each and every of these 8 days, that is to say in the morning service usually, but you could do it anytime during the day, but morning service is the usual. The entire Hallel is recited. Before it, you should say the blessing. The person, blessed are you, Adonai our God, the ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to complete the Hallel, or as we say, not from Rambam's liturgy, but from the Ashkenazic liturgy, to read Hallel, likro et Hallel. So we have a slightly different blessing from the Sephardic world. And then as he explains, even though the reading of the Hallel is a mitzvah ordained by the sages, one may recite the blessing, who sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us. Okay, so this is a small detour to a really big topic that we're going to have to do in a short amount of time. What Rambam is trying to explain to us here is a really big concept, which is, how can I say, Asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu adlik ner shel Hanukkah? How can I say God has commanded me to light the light of Hanukkah when it's not in the Torah? right? The story of Hanukkah is not in the Torah, right? God commanded me to keep Shabbat. I got that, right? No problem. God commanded me to have the sukkah. God commanded me to shake the lulav. But those are in the Torah. Hanukkah is not in the Torah. How do we handle this? Because we definitely know that we have been saying this for more than 2,000 years. It might be useful if we understood why we say that we are commanded to celebrate Hanukkah, even if Hanukkah is not in the Torah. And by the way, this also is somewhat related to the celebration of Purim. The explanation is, and where did we command? This is taken from the Talmud. Where were we commanded to light a Hanukkah lamp? Meaning the Talmud itself asks this question, like, I've read the entire Torah, and I don't see Hanukkah anywhere. Rav Avaya said it derives from the verse, "You shall not turn aside." Oh, good. Perfectly clear, right? Everybody understands. The whole verse, taken from the book of Deuteronomy, is, and according to the instruction, which is the word Torah, that they instruct you, meaning the leaders of your generation, and the rulings that they say to you, you will act. You will do that. You will not turn aside from the things that they tell you, either to the right or the left. What this is saying is that when the Sanhedrin, when the Jewish court makes a ruling, and because their ruling is fulfilling this verse of Torah, by listening to their ruling, you are observing this commandment. Let's see if we can let that sink in for a second. Right? It's, if I tell you, let's imagine I'm the king, right? I'm the king, and I say, I need to go to the other room. And when I leave, Jimmy here, he speaks with my voice. And whatever he says, do it. And I leave the room. And I think we all need to do a few laps around the building. Let's go for a run. He's not really commanding you. You're not really doing it because he said it. You're listening to him because the king told you to listen to him. Therefore, because he's in that position, he has a unique opportunity to lead. Now, really, there's a long debate about this, which is why I'm saying I'm going to shorten it. Really, we're only use the phrase Asher Kidishanu, that God commanded us, when we talk about things that were established by the Sanhedrin, by the great court of Jerusalem. So if I tell you to run around the building, you don't say that God commanded you to run around the building just because I'm your rabbi. There is also, yes, some rabbinic authority that as the rabbi in your midst rules, that is the way that God wants you to live. That is the ruling that God wants you to have. But we don't use the phrase commandedness. So there's still authority without commanding. We save that for the things that were put in place by the Sanhedrin. So we're not adding new Asher Kidishanus for a long, long time. Make sense? Okay. It's an important idea, because otherwise we would wonder how, once the Bible was closed, we could ever have new mitzvot. And this is how it is. But you will notice we don't have a bunch of mitzvahs like this. There's not like, new mitzvahs coming out every week in the newspaper. We are very, very careful before we say this is commanded. We make lots of customs. We make lots of what's the right word? Fences. That is to say, protections and guidelines for how to live. But as far as commandments go, the sages did not put many bonus commandments in place. They were very, very careful not to do that. Okay. Okay, so as Ramban goes on to point out, this had to be the case, that you need this. He says there's a need for this commandment, meaning the Deuteronomy line, because the Torah was given to us in writing. Right? The Torah was not put into our mind. The Torah wasn't put into our heart so that we were all programmed like a computer. This is a book. And that means that not all the opinions are the same concerning its implications, right? If we all read the same book, let's imagine we all go read Harry Potter, and we come back and I ask you, did Harry Potter make a good decision? We're all going to have different arguments. And by the way, I don't think he ever made a good decision in his life. If he was my kid, I would have been very disappointed. But that's another story. But each one of us would have our own opinion. If we see a movie and we walk out of the movie theater, some of you might think it's a good movie, some of you might think it's a bad movie, some of you might think that the movie meant this, some of you might think the movie meant that. And as Ramban points out, this is Nachmanides, then the disagreements would grow. And the Torah would become several Torahs. There would be the Torah of people who like Harry Potter and the Torah of people who don't like Harry Potter. And it would split. So by having the Sanhedrin, by having a group that could and make a decision, and then the people had to follow those decisions, that is what helped keep the interpretations from going too far away. And you'll know when you read more and more of the words of the rabbis about what to do, but they always come to a conclusion about what to do. They leave open lots of room for what to think and for what to feel. That's very important. But when it comes time to doing, they reach a conclusion so that we end up as still one people with one path. It's a wide path. It's not, super narrow. It's not so limited, but it is, the edges of it are usually pretty clear. Make sense? Okay. This one's, I know, small writing, and I'll give you the short version of it. In our prayers for the Amidah, there is a prayer that we say every day called Modin. It is the next to last prayer. So it's number 18 if you're counting on the weekday. And that's the prayer where we say, thank you, God, for everything you do for us. And it's very general, very open of saying that God gives us miracles every day. Right? Morning, noon, and night, we are always being given miracles. When Hanukkah comes around, we add this paragraph into that blessing in order to say, and also this miracle we want to say thank you for. Because this miracle was kind of unique. The only thing that was close to it is Purim. And we also do a paragraph for Purim that's very similar. And so it begins, let's see if I can get through this in time, for the miracles, for the salvation, for the mighty deeds, for the victories, for the battles that you performed for our ancestors in those days, at this time. That's sort of the opening sentence. In the days of Mattathias, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hashmonean, and his sons, the wicked Greek-like people, right? They weren't carrying Greek passports. The Greek kingdom rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and compel them to stray from the statutes of your will. Right? Remember, these Seleucids wanted us to stop reading Torah. They wanted us to stop observing Shabbat. They wanted us to stop circumcising our children. They tried to just Judaism. You, in your great mercy, stood up for them in their time of distress. It wasn't only because our people were good fighters. It was because God was with us that we were able to win. Their grievance, judge their claim, and avenge their wrong. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, the wanton into the hands of the diligent students of your Torah. So this is a lovely example of parallel phrasing, back and forth. And the poetry in the Hebrew is much nicer than the English. You're just going to have to trust me there. Work on your Hebrew and you'll see. For you yourself, you made a great and holy name in your world, and for your people Israel, you worked a great victory and salvation as this very day. Notice how that slips in at the end. So God did all of this. God did the whole miracle. God was doing everything. And so too today. Because one of the things that people often think about is, well, wait a minute. If I'm living in the middle of the 1400s in France, life isn't so perfect for me as a Jewish person. Where's my victory, right? Where's my war to help me? This is reminding us that you are still alive, despite the enemies around you, despite all of the problems that our people face. God is still defending you, and God is still letting you be here to say this prayer, to say thank you, and to have this experience. So it may not be the War of the Maccabees, and it is still a miracle that is happening for you. And many people miss that. They think that miracles are only the huge battles, or miracles are only the parting of the sea and other big, flashy Hollywood miracles, I like to call them. But that isn't the case. God gives us more miracles each day than God ever gave in the Hollywood style, because just being alive is a miracle, and being able to experience this world is a miracle. We just ignore them. We take them for granted. So this is giving us that contrast of, yes, that was a huge miracle, and thank you. But don't forget today, right? Because today is also a miracle. Thereafter, your children came to the Holy of Holies of your house, the temple. They cleansed your temple, purified the site of your holiness, and lit the lights in the courtyard of your sanctuary. You may notice this paragraph sounds a lot like the book of Maccabees. Right? They're not talking about the oil being found or anything. They're talking about the book of Maccabees, the victory of rededicating the temple. These 8 days of Hanukkah to express thanks and praise to your great name, which was important. They didn't just say, hooray for us. They said, hooray for God. Make sense? After you've read this a few years, it is easier to say. Okay. Before we get into dreidel and other customs, I just want to make sure that now that we've done the meat, the main parts of Hanukkah, that everyone is basically clear on what Hanukkah is and how we celebrate Hanukkah, right? And the spirit that Hanukkah should have in us, the fire of the lights. Good. Let's talk about some of the silly parts, because Hanukkah is also fun. So one of the silliest things is dreidel. Please hold up the dreidel for everyone to see. A little hard to see from there, not really a perfect visual aid. Dreidel is a very common symbol of Hanukkah, but it's actually not very old, that particular game. The idea that we played games as a way of tricking the Seleucids, of tricking the army into thinking that we were not studying Torah, that is a very old idea. But the specific game of dreidel is actually, for Judaism, pretty new. The game, as near as people can find, began in Ireland and England in around the 1500s. And it spread to Europe. So if you go into Germany in the 1500s, you'll find a game where they play, and when they play, if they get an N, it's nicht, right? It's nothing. If they get a G, it's ganz, right? You take it all. If you get an H, it's alb, which is you get half. And if it's an S, you get shtel, which is you put in. And some genius Jewish person said, hey, wait a minute. Nes gadol haya sham. It fits. Right? 4 Jewish words, which mean a miracle that was great. In English, we'd say a great miracle, but it works better in Spanish. Right? A great miracle happened or was there. There being the land of Israel. So Nes Gadol Haya Sham fit the German that we already knew, which had come from England and Ireland. And thus, the game of dreidel was born. But it is still a great fun way to think of it as being the same way that we would play games, because we were secretly learning as a way of being defiant, of not giving in to the king. And I always think it's a little funny that the king was okay if we sat around playing games and gambling, but he wasn't okay if we were studying to be better people. If you have to choose between having good and educated people and people who just sit around gambling, if you're a king, which do you want in your kingdom? But, you know, that's the way they were. Okay, so that's dreidel in a tiny bit. And by the way, no one ever became a professional dreidel champion. It's a game only of luck. There is no skill, no strategy, no plan. It's just a silly game. Food. Has food with it, except Yom Kippur. So what are the foods of Hanukkah? There are 2 main Hanukkah foods, Hanukkah treats, apart from just having a nice meal. One of them is latkes. And latkes are like a flat potato pancake. You take the potato and you grind it, or you grate it like grating cheese, and then you fry it in a pan. And it's all nice and gold and oily and lovely. And sour cream and applesauce are usually used with it, but you can put anything on it. And it's only about 200 years old. Which, remember, in Judaism, 200 years old is like a baby. Because potatoes are new. Right? But the Maccabees never saw a potato. right? Rambam never saw a potato. Moses never saw a potato, because potatoes are from the Americas,
Peru, I think.
from Peru, exactly, from the Incas and that area. So when the potatoes got to Europe, everyone said this is a miracle food, and they began to use it for lots of things. And there was already a recipe of using vegetable pancakes that was very popular. And then they just swapped potatoes in rather than beets or carrots or other things. And you know what? Potatoes are better. So we still use potatoes. So that was very common in Europe. In the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities, that is to say North Africa and the Middle East, the more popular food was sufganiyot. And sufganiyot are donuts. If you've ever had like a jelly donut, that's a sufganiyah. That's the same thing. And the word sufganiyah comes from the Hebrew word svog, which means a sponge. And actually you can see it even has the same root letters as the English word sponge. Just got to go look at it, trust me. And that's because the donut is spongy. You just take the dough and you roll it up, you fry it, you take it out and you put the jelly inside and boom, jelly donut. Dunkin' Donuts still does them, exactly right. And if you go to Israel, sufganiyot are still the most popular food for Hanukkah in Israel. Latkes are, home food, but when you go out, it's like all the parties are sufganiyot.
They do like one of say this they make it like a
Purim.
The ear.
You're thinking of
Oh,
Purim.
that's Purim.
Yeah,
Okay.
the Oznei Haman or Hamantashen is a Purim food, and it's the cookie that looks like Haman's ears or Haman's hat, depending upon how you look at it. We'll talk about Purim when we get closer.
I was missing.
Like I said, we've got lots of foods. Okay, and that, if I'm not mistaken, yes, that was my last slide for tonight. Questions? I should pass around a quiz after each one, see how well you were paying attention.
Did you eat any fried food?
What's that?
For Hanukkah, could you eat any fried food?
Well, absolutely. So as far as customs go, a lot of people will use fried foods because they like the oil connected to the lighting of the Hanukkah. And a lot of people even will try to use oil for lighting their Hanukkah. It's messy and tricky. But if you go on Amazon, you can find they do sell these little things that you can put into the candle holder for that will burn oil, and it's a little bit nicer like that. But I'll turn to candles once we got good cheap paraffin wax, right? Because the smoke is pouring out everywhere and the oil gets on everything. It is a horrible mess. But it is also kind of pretty. When you read old Jewish books, they'll talk about how you shouldn't use candles for lots of mitzvot. Used to have were made from fat, from animal fat. And when the candle was burning, it would stink and it would make noise. It would be like, the sound of the sound of frying meat, because it kind of was frying meat, and it was made even more smoke. So when they talk about not using candles, they're talking about the old fat candles. Our modern paraffin wax candles are beautiful. They leave almost no wax, and they have and they have such a lovely color to them. And the light is like perfectly steady. It's not, big and small. So yeah, candles are fine. And you're okay if you want to use candles. I use candles. But if you ever want to experiment just to see what the oil is like, once, maybe on the first night when you're only lighting one candle.
Is there a reason to eat milk?
For Hanukkah? I've never heard of milk with Hanukkah. For Shavuot, which is at the beginning of summer, there is a custom to eat dairy, to eat milk or cheese and things like that. That's when. Yeah. Let me put a little early commercial in. On Shavuot is when we have our cheesecake competition. Yeah.
I remember now. Yeah.
So start working on your recipes.
I do. I test that.
You remember that, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So remember, next Tuesday night is the first night of Hanukkah. Good? Next Tuesday night.
13th, right?
Next Tuesday night, the 25th of Kislev. I'm never good on English dates. I know that it's next. It's the 12th is the first night, the first candle. The 13th is the first day. Exactly. And that's why it's so hard when you say the 13th. It's like, do you mean night or day? So
Are we gonna have class next Thursday?
we will have class next Thursday. Yes, Hanukkah, even though it's a fun holiday, is still a holiday when we work and do. We can drive and write and all those things. So we'll still have class next Thursday. Good. Good.
Yes, then.